They called it a hotel, but its walls whispered of something else, something not meant to be seen. If you could walk through its halls tonight, you wouldn't hear laughter or footsteps. Only the echo of doors that locked from the outside and the faint, metallic smell of death clinging to the wallpaper. This was Chicago, 1893, the year the World's Fair painted the city white with optimism. But behind the bright lights stood a building that turned hope into horror. It was 3 stories high, sprawling across an entire block, and yet no one truly knew what lay inside. Even the workers who built it couldn't make sense of its strange design. Staircases that went nowhere, hallways that ended in bricked-up walls, rooms with no windows, and gas pipes leading to chambers that no one was supposed to find. And presiding over it all was a man whose face could charm a room but whose mind was an abyss, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, the man history would one day call America's first serial killer. This is not just a story about murder. This is a story about control, about how one man created a machine that turned trust into terror, and how an entire city looked the other way until it was too late. You are about to descend with me into the labyrinth of Holmes' murder castle. But understand this, the deeper we go, the less you will trust the world you thought you knew. Because this was not just crime, it was an experiment in human fear. Holmes wasn't killing at random. He was building a system, a psychological trap designed to make his victims walk willingly into their own deaths. Tonight, I'm going to take you inside this nightmare, room by room, lie by lie, until you see what no one was ever meant to see. This is the secret history of the murder castle, and by the end of this journey, you will not be the same person who started it. Stay with me. The descent begins now. The first time people stepped through the front doors of Holmes' castle, they felt a strange unease they couldn't explain. The air was too still, the ceilings too low, and the hallways stretched longer than they should have, like the building was watching them. It was advertised as a hotel for travelers coming to the World's Fair, a place of rest, safety, and affordable luxury. But Holmes didn't build this place to welcome guests. He built it to consume them. Every wall, every hinge, every secret panel was planned with precision, as if he was building a living organism that fed on fear. He kept the blueprints locked away, changing them constantly so no worker ever knew what the entire building looked like. One carpenter recalled being ordered to install a wall one week, then tear it down the next, as if Holmes wanted no one but himself to understand the map of his creation. When the final version stood completed, its corridors twisted like veins, feeding into rooms whose true purpose only Holmes knew. Some were lined with soundproofing so no screams could escape. Others were airtight chambers with gas pipes that could be turned on from a hidden panel in Holmes' office. There were chutes that led straight to the basement, where furnaces and vats of acid waited, ready to erase any evidence that a person had ever existed. Holmes smiled at his guests as he checked them in, his voice warm, his handshake soft, leading them into a place designed for their destruction. It is said that he would walk the hallways late at night, keys jingling, listening to the muffled sobs of the trapped, deciding when their time was up. To him, they were not victims, they were components in an experiment. He wanted to know how long a person could endure terror before they broke. This building wasn't just a murder. It was a laboratory of human suffering, and Holmes was its conductor. And the city outside, it kept celebrating the World's Fair, never suspecting that just blocks away, the devil himself was running a business in plain sight. To understand the man who built this place, you have to strip away the mask he wore in public. Holmes was not just a murderer, He was a master manipulator who turned his entire life into a performance. Born Herman Webster Mudgett in New Hampshire, he grew up fascinated by death, dissecting animals as a boy and later studying medicine not out of compassion, but out of hunger for control. He learned how to fake documents, how to disappear behind aliases, how to charm his way into money and power. By the time he arrived in Chicago, he had already perfected the role of a gentleman doctor, a man too respectable to be questioned. But beneath the polished exterior was a predator who saw every person as a potential piece in his puzzle. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to own the process from beginning to end. That's why the murder castle was not simply a building, but an extension of Holmes himself, a place where he could play God. Every room was a test, every hallway a trial, every trap a sermon in his twisted theology. The gas chamber wasn't just a method, it was a statement. It allowed Holmes to decide who breathed and who didn't, flipping life and death on and off like a switch. The chute to the basement wasn't just for disposal, it was ritual, a final act of erasing his victim from the world. And through it all, Holmes remained calm, almost casual, as if nothing he did was wrong. Witnesses later said he had the ability to make you feel like the only person in the room, locking eyes with you until you trusted him completely, and that was when you were in the most danger. This was the genius of Holmes. He didn't just build a murder house. He built a narrative, one in which his victims wrote themselves in as willing characters. And once you stepped into his world, there was no way out. That is what makes this story so terrifying. The murder castle wasn't about random violence. It was about design, calculation, and the slow tightening of a noose you didn't even realize was around your neck until it was too late. Imagine stepping through the front door of the murder castle. The lobby feels normal at first, polished floors, a front desk where Holmes greets you with that polite, professional smile. He signs you in, maybe asks about your visit to the World's Fair, makes a joke to put you at ease. But as soon as you turn the corner, the illusion begins to crack. The hallway stretches unnaturally long, the gaslights flicker, and the silence feels too heavy. Your footsteps echo in a way that makes you feel small, as though something is listening. Doors line the corridor, but some have no handles on the inside. Some open into bare brick walls. You pass a stairway that twists upward but ends abruptly in a dead stop. There is no map, no guidance, and every turn looks the same, designed to disorient you. Holmes leads you to your room and locks the door behind you. You don't hear the click, but you feel it, the way a trapped animal knows the cage is shut. The room seems ordinary until you notice the vents near the floor. You kneel to look closer and see tiny holes, too small for air to pass through but perfect for gas. Somewhere, hidden behind the walls, a valve waits for Holmes' hand. And then there is the peepholes, almost invisible, drilled through the wall so he can watch you from the darkness on the other side. This is where his power begins, where your sense of safety is replaced by an uneasy awareness that you are not alone. The entire building is designed to spy on you, trap you, and, when the moment comes, kill you without leaving a trace. Behind one hidden panel is a secret staircase Holmes uses to appear in places you thought were secure. Behind another is the chute that drops straight to the basement, where furnaces roar, waiting for whatever or whoever comes down. This was not just architecture. It was a maze meant to break the human spirit, turning its guests into prey before the hunt even began. And Holmes? He moved through it all with ease, like a spider gliding along its web. The first victims didn't realize they were walking into history. They thought they were just finding a place to stay. Many of them were young women, drawn to Chicago by the promise of the World's Fair, eager to work, to see the future, to escape small-town lives. Holmes knew this. He advertised his hotel specifically to traveling women, offering cheap rooms and employment opportunities. He had a way of making them feel chosen, special, as if he saw something in them no one else did. He would smile, speak gently, offer them work as a stenographer or secretary. And by the end of the day, they were not just guests, they were part of his household. They trusted him because everyone trusted him. He was a doctor, a businessman, a charming man with perfect manners. But once they entered the castle, their connection to the outside world began to vanish. Letters they sent home never reached their families. Their trunks and clothes were confiscated and sold. They were moved from room to room until they no longer knew which way was out. And then, one night, they would simply disappear. No one saw them leave. No one saw them alive again, and no one asked questions. Chicago was overflowing with newcomers during the fair, and people went missing every day. The city wrote them off as runaways or Holmes knew this too. That was his camouflage. He chose victims the world would not miss. Some of them he is said to have lured into the soundproof rooms under the pretense of showing them something private, something just for them. Once inside, he would close the door, turn the lock, and then wait. Some died quickly, asphyxiated by gas Holmes released from his hidden panel. Others were kept alive longer, left in the darkness to panic, to scream, to beg, until their voices gave out. The basement became the final destination. Holmes had a surgical table down there, along with vats of acid, quicklime pits, and a furnace big enough to cremate a human body. Some say he even sold skeletons to medical schools, turning murder into profit. Every disappearance fed the castle's legend, but at the time, no one dared to connect the dots. With every disappearance, Holmes grew bolder. The city outside was too distracted to notice the growing list of missing persons, and the castle had become a perfect machine for erasing evidence. Holmes began to experiment, not just with murder, but with power itself. He started luring investors, creditors, and rivals into the castle under the guise of business meetings, knowing they would never walk out again. His confidence was terrifying because it was quiet. He didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't leave loose ends. If someone came looking for a missing employee, Holmes would smile sadly, say she'd left for another job, even offer to help track her down. His calm made people believe him. It wasn't just that he killed, it was how he killed. Holmes turned death into a process, a ritual, and the castle became his theater. He is believed to have built special trapdoors that allowed him to appear and disappear from rooms, using the building itself to frighten and disorient his victims before the final act. Some reports suggest he would watch his victims through peepholes, taking notes, learning how fear worked, studying how people behaved when they knew they were going to die. This wasn't about impulse. This was about mastery. He used his victims' psychology against them, feeding them hope one moment and terror the next. Some were locked in airtight rooms, while Holmes pumped gas inside, but he didn't kill them right away. He would wait, let them struggle, let them pound on the doors until their strength was gone. And when their bodies were finally dragged to the basement, he stripped them of everything, jewelry, clothing, even their bones had value. He sold skeletons to universities, organs to medical labs, and belongings to pawn shops. Holmes didn't just murder. He profited. And still, the city did nothing. Chicago was celebrating progress, industry, and the fair. Nobody wanted to look too closely at the building on the corner that had so many tenants but never seemed to empty a room. The castle was working exactly as Holmes had planned. It was swallowing people, quietly, invisibly, and Holmes walked through its halls like a king inspecting his kingdom. Eventually, the whispers began. People started to notice that young women who went to work for Holmes simply vanished. Neighbors recalled seeing trunks being carried out of the building at odd hours, late at night, when no guests were supposed to be moving. Some employees of the castle, the few who dared stay, told of strange orders walls, built and rebuilt for no reason, sealed rooms no one was allowed to enter, and the smell of burning from the basement that never seemed to stop. But Holmes had a way of silencing suspicion before it could grow. If someone questioned him, he would charm them, offering a convincing explanation and a reassuring smile. If that didn't work, they simply stopped asking, sometimes because they left town, sometimes because they too disappeared. Holmes rotated staff constantly so that no one ever saw too much. He paid workers late, fired them quickly, and made sure no one stayed long enough to piece together the full layout of the building. Even those who thought something was wrong rarely dared to go against him. He had the presence of a man who could ruin you with a word, a man who knew things about you that you didn't want revealed. That was his greatest weapon, fear without evidence. And still, the disappearances mounted. Travelers coming to see the World's Fair never made it home. Room after room sat locked for days after guests had checked in, then was suddenly emptied and cleaned in the middle of the night. One former employee would later testify that he saw Holmes carrying heavy trunks to the basement himself, as if he didn't trust anyone else to handle what was inside. And yet, Chicago's police force, overwhelmed by the flood of crime in a booming city, didn't prioritize missing persons. In an age with no national registry, no digital records, and no fast communication, a missing person could simply be forgotten. Holmes knew this better than anyone. He had built a perfect storm, a city too busy to notice, victims too isolated to be missed, and a building that devoured everything placed inside it. The castle was no longer just a trap, was a secret that the city itself seemed unwilling to expose. The first real crack in Holmes' perfect facade didn't come from the police, came from someone who knew him too well. Benjamin Pettersell was Holmes' trusted associate, a man who helped manage the castle and carried out Holmes' schemes. But even Pettersell started to notice that something was wrong, that Holmes' appetite for deception was growing out of control. Holmes had moved from insurance fraud and small scams to something darker, something that even his accomplices couldn't ignore. Whispers of murder were turning into accusations, and creditors were beginning to circle. Holmes owed money to suppliers, investors, and banks, and some of them were threatening lawsuits. To protect himself, Holmes became more ruthless. He began eliminating loose ends, not just strangers, but people who knew too much about the castle's inner workings. Former employees vanished. Business partners suddenly left town. Holmes' charm was starting to crack at the edges, revealing the predator beneath. But it wasn't until insurance investigators began questioning one of Holmes' many fraudulent claims that a real inquiry into his activities began. Holmes had staged fires, faked thefts, and forged documents to collect money, and for years he got away with it. But now, with larger sums involved, insurance companies started to dig deeper. They noticed patents claims tied to Holmes. Properties burned suspiciously soon after being insured, names that could not be traced. At the same time, rumors about the castle were spreading faster. People living near the building reported hearing screams in the middle of the night. The foul smell from the basement grew harder to ignore. Some neighbors said they saw Holmes carrying large bundles out of the castle alone. Always at night, always with that same calm expression. Still, he remained untouchable. His politeness, his reputation, and his skill at deception kept everyone at bay. He smiled at investigators, gave confident answers, and bought himself more time. But time was no longer his ally. The net was tightening, even if he didn't see it yet. For the first time, the castle was becoming a place of interest, not just to the curious, but to those who could expose what lay inside. And Holmes. He began to sense that the world was watching, and it only made him more dangerous. The closer the outside world crept toward the castle, the more Holmes tightened his grip on the horrors within. Suspicion did not slow him, it accelerated him. He became more reckless, more desperate, as if trying to outpace the inevitable. Those who stood in his way were removed, quietly and efficiently. A stenographer who questioned unpaid wages vanished. A creditor who demanded repayment was last seen entering the castle and never came out. Even his business partner, Benjamin Petzel, began to fear for his life as Holmes grew erratic, speaking of new schemes, new insurance policies, and new ways to make money fast. The castle itself seemed to grow darker. Guests reported that the hallways no longer felt merely strange, they felt hostile, as though the walls were closing in. Some claimed to hear footsteps behind them, only to turn and find no one there. The smell from the basement was so overpowering that neighbors complained, but Holmes dismissed it as chemical work for his glass-bending experiments, a convenient lie that silenced most questions. Yet inside, he was refining his process. He perfected the use of gas lines, experimented with trapdoors and sliding panels, and even tested different ways to dispose of bodies more efficiently. Witnesses would later describe a massive furnace glowing day and night, its fire never dying, its smoke curling up into the Chicago sky like a signal no one dared interpret. Holmes was turning his crimes into routine, a system that could keep running even as the noose tightened. But cracks were forming not just in his finances, but in his alliances. People who once trusted him began to fear him. His creditors became louder, his lawsuits more numerous. And still, the disappearances continued. Chicago was starting to notice that too many women had entered the castle and never left. A city that had celebrated progress and modernity was beginning to feel that something evil was festering at its heart. The murder castle was no longer just a curiosity, was becoming a legend whispered in bars, a warning parents gave their daughters. Holmes, always calm, always smiling, did not slow down. If anything, he seemed to revel in the growing fear, as though the terror itself was feeding him, making him sharper, faster, more cunning. By 1894, Holmes' debts had caught up with him, and he knew the castle alone could no longer sustain his lifestyle. That was when he conceived his boldest, most dangerous plan, yet a scheme so audacious it could only have come from a man who believed he was untouchable. He convinced Benjamin Petzel, his loyal associate, to take out a $10,000 life insurance policy. The plan was simple: fake Petzel's death, collect the payout, and split the money. But with Holmes, nothing was ever simple. He staged the scene meticulously, arranging for a body burned and disfigured to be discovered in a rented building. The corpse was presented as Petzel's, but in truth, it was a stranger Holmes had murdered to play the part. At least, that was the story Holmes told. Pitterzel's family. In reality, Holmes double-crossed everyone. He actually killed Pitterzel, using chloroform to render him unconscious and then setting his body on fire. He collected the insurance money, keeping it for himself, and then did something far worse. He took custody of 3 of Pitterzel's children, telling their mother that he was caring for them while they traveled. Holmes moved the children from city to city, separating them using fake names, weaving a web of lies so complex that no one could follow. This was Holmes at his most dangerous, no longer just killing strangers, but manipulating an entire family, turning their grief into leverage. He wrote letters to Mrs. Pitterzel to keep her calm, all while methodically eliminating the only witnesses who could connect him to the crime. 2 of the children were later found dead, their bodies hidden, their final hours too haunting to fully describe. This was the turning point. What Holmes had done could no longer be ignored. Pinkerton detectives, hired by the insurance company, began to track him relentlessly, tracing his movements across state lines, following the trail of lies and bodies. For the first time, Holmes was being hunted by men as meticulous as he was. Men who would not be charmed, who would not be fooled. The net was closing, and Holmes could feel it. The castle stood silent behind him, but the secrets buried within its walls were about to be ripped open for the world to see. Holmes was finally caught in Boston, in 1894. Not for murder, but for horse theft. A lesser crime that put him behind bars just long enough for investigators to unravel the rest. Once in custody, the Pinkertons and police began pulling at every thread Holmes had left behind. Insurance fraud, missing persons, the deaths of Pitterzel and his children. But it was when investigators turned their attention to the castle in Chicago that the true scope of his crimes began to emerge. What they found inside defied comprehension. They discovered a maze of trapdoors, secret passages, hidden rooms, and false walls exactly as witnesses had described. They found soundproof chambers with scorch marks near the vents, suggesting gas had been pumped into them. They found strange surgical tables, pits filled with quicklime, and piles of ash in the basement furnace, large enough to suggest human remains had been burned there. The smell of death still lingered in the walls. Some rooms had restraints bolted to the floor. Others had sliding doors that could lock automatically from the outside. It was not just a crime scene. It was a house built for killing. The newspapers called it the Murder Castle, and the name stuck, capturing the imagination of a horrified public. Crowds gathered outside the building, staring up at its windows, trying to picture the atrocities that had taken place behind them. Police brought out bones, charred fragments of clothing, and even complete skeletons. Each discovery deepened the sense of dread. Chicago, a city that had celebrated its progress with the World's Fair just months earlier, was now confronted with the reality that one of its most successful businessmen had been running a slaughterhouse for years without anyone stopping him. The press turned Holmes into a national sensation, painting him as the devil in human form. And Holmes, ever the showman, seemed to enjoy the attention. He gave interviews from jail, smiling, calm, refusing to admit the full extent of what he had done. He spoke of his own brilliance, his charm, his cleverness, as though his crimes were proof of his superiority. But the evidence was overwhelming, and for the first time, Holmes could not manipulate his way out. The castle had betrayed him, its walls now speaking louder than his lies ever could. When Holmes' trial began in 1895, the courtroom became his new stage. He arrived impeccably dressed, polite, and eerily calm, as though he were not a man accused of some of the most grotesque crimes in American history, but a gentleman attending a business meeting. Spectators filled every seat. Reporters crowded the benches, all desperate to catch a glimpse of the man they now called the Beast of Chicago. And Holmes thrived on the attention. He spoke with charm, smiling at the jury, explaining away evidence as if it were all a misunderstanding. He even dismissed his lawyers at one point and represented himself, questioning witnesses with chilling composure, turning cross-examinations into opportunities to show off his intelligence. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence: the remains found in the castle, the testimonies of former employees, the fraudulent insurance schemes, and most damning of all, the proof of Pettersall's murder and the deaths of his children. Holmes listened, nodding, sometimes even taking notes, never losing his composure. This was not remorse, it was control. He wanted to shape how history would remember him. He even wrote an autobiography from his jail cell, describing himself as a gentleman criminal and suggesting that his own physical appearance was changing, that his face was taking on a demonic shape, as if he were becoming the monster the press portrayed him to be. This only added to the public's fascination. Holmes was no longer just a man on trial. He was becoming a myth, a symbol of something darker lurking beneath the surface of America's Gilded Age. Yet the jury saw through the performance. They deliberated for just a few hours before finding him guilty of murder. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging. Even then, he showed no fear. He requested to be buried in a coffin filled with cement, fearing that after his death, his body might be stolen and dissected like those he had once sold to medical schools. It was a final act of control, an attempt to keep his story his own. But by now, the murder castle had become part of American legend, and no burial could silence what its walls had revealed. Holmes was hanged on May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Even in death, he refused to give the world what it wanted. He never confessed to the full number of murders, never admitted the full extent of what he had done inside the castle. He went to the gallows with the same cold calm that had unnerved everyone since his arrest, standing straight, composed, as though he was still in control. When the trapdoor opened, Holmes' neck did not snap cleanly. He strangled slowly, taking nearly 20 minutes to die, his body swaying as if refusing to surrender. Witnesses said it was as if the devil himself was fighting to stay in the world just a little longer. After his execution, the castle remained standing, an empty shell filled with secrets. But the people of Chicago couldn't bear its presence. In 1895, while Holmes was still alive, a mysterious fire swept through the building, gutting much of its interior. Some said it was arson, perhaps an attempt to destroy evidence that still lingered in its walls, or maybe to erase the nightmare altogether. Whatever the cause, the castle was left a charred ruin, blackened against the skyline, a reminder that evil had once lived there. Yet the ruins attracted crowds. People came from across the country to stare at the burned remains, as if hoping to glimpse the horror that had happened inside. The newspapers printed every rumor they could find: secret tunnels under the streets, entire rooms filled with bones, even claims that Holmes had confessed to killing over 200 people, though no such confession was ever proven. The legend only grew darker. Parents warned their children about the castle as if it were a ghost story. For years after, locals swore they could still smell the faint stench of burning from the site. Even though the fires had long been put out, the land itself seemed cursed, a scar on the city that no amount of progress could heal. Chicago tried to move on, but the memory of Holmes' castle hung over it like a shadow. A reminder that behind the shining lights of the World's Fair had stood a place where nightmares were made real, even after Holmes' execution. The legend of the murder castle refused to die. Investigators and journalists kept returning to the ruins, digging through what little remained, searching for answers that never seemed to come. The more they uncovered, the stranger the story became. Some claimed there were entire rooms still hidden, sealed behind the fire-damaged walls, chambers that no one had ever entered. Others insisted there were tunnels connecting the castle to nearby buildings, allowing Holmes to transport victims without being seen. No full blueprint of the building was ever found, and that mystery became fuel for decades of speculation. Writers compared the castle to a living creature, a parasite that had fed on the city's prosperity and left a carcass behind. What disturbed people most was the thought that Holmes had done all of this in plain sight, with no one stopping him, no one even noticing. That fact was harder to accept than the murders themselves. It forced the public to confront something uncomfortable, that evil does not always hide in darkness. Sometimes it stands in the open, shakes your hand, smiles at you, and sells you a room for the night. The castle became a mirror held up to society, showing what happens when greed, ambition, and indifference combine. In the years that followed, new reports surfaced suggesting Holmes had accomplices who were never caught, men who may have helped build the castle or dispose of bodies. Some even claimed Holmes faked his own death, that the man who swung from the gallows wasn't Holmes at all but a substitute, and that the real Holmes escaped to continue his crimes elsewhere. Historians dismissed this as fantasy, but the rumor persisted, because people could not accept that such a mind could be silenced by a rope. They wanted Holmes to still be out there, lurking, a reminder that monsters walk among us. And in a way, he still was, because the murder castle had entered American folklore. It was no longer just a building or a man. It was a symbol of something far more unsettling, that progress and horror often grow side by side, and that the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. The murder castle was gone, but its shadows spread wider every year. It became a warning, a riddle, and a symbol of how much horror can hide behind respectability. The newspapers of the late 19th century had printed every gruesome detail they could find, and by the time the 20th century arrived, Holmes was no longer just a man, he was a myth. His story passed from journalists to writers, from writers to pulp magazines, and finally into the realm of urban legend. People said that the land where the castle once stood was cursed, that new buildings erected there would fail, that strange noises echoed through the foundations late at night. Some construction crews refused to work there, claiming they felt watched. Their tools going missing, hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there. Even when the city finally redeveloped the site, locals whispered that it could never be fully cleansed, that the ground itself was soaked in fear. As we trace this descent together, you are part of something bigger than a simple crime story. You are standing at the threshold of a place that once turned human life into currency, where ambition swallowed morality whole. And I want to know, where are you watching from? Comment below and tell me your city, your country. Let us know how far the shadow of Holmes Castle reaches today, because this story no longer belongs just to Chicago. It belongs to anyone who has ever wondered what real evil looks like when it smiles. Think about this. How many castles still exist today, hidden behind ordinary walls, disguised as normal businesses or homes? How many people walk past them every day, unaware that a predator has built a maze right in the heart of their community? That is the most chilling legacy of Holmes, Not the murders we know about, but the ones we never discovered. Each new revelation about the castle feels like peeling away another layer of skin, exposing something raw and pulsing underneath. And with each layer, we move closer to a truth most people aren't ready to face. The castle was not just a building, it was a blueprint, a model of how power, secrecy, and cruelty can coexist right in front of us. And that blueprint didn't die with Holmes. It is still here, waiting for someone clever enough, ruthless enough, to build it again. Holmes was not the first killer in American history, but he became something new, something terrifyingly modern. Before Holmes' murder was usually personal, crimes of passion, greed, or revenge. But Holmes showed the world a killer who turned death into a business model. He industrialized murder, mechanized it, planned it with cold precision, and made it profitable. That concept shocked America. This was the age of steel mills, railroads, assembly lines, an age obsessed with efficiency. And Holmes brought that same efficiency to killing. He was not driven by rage, but by opportunity. Each victim was a calculation, each murder a move in a larger game. This made him fascinating and horrifying in equal measure, and the public could not look away. The very thing that made them fear him also made them crave every detail of his story. In many ways, Holmes created the template for the serial killer archetype that would dominate the 20th century. Charming, intelligent, untouchable, almost inhuman in his ability to blend into society. He became a mythic figure, both monster and genius. A man who turned the city into his hunting ground and outsmarted almost everyone until the very end. His trial transcripts, his prison confessions, real and fabricated, were devoured by a public that could not get enough. This is where something darker began to happen. Holmes became entertainment. Newspapers made money by printing his story, penny dreadfuls exaggerated it, and lecture halls filled with curious citizens who wanted to hear about the castle. The horror had become a spectacle. This is the paradox we still live with today. The more we fear evil, the more we are drawn to it. The story of Holmes became a mirror America could not look away from, because it reflected something they did not want to admit, that the same culture that built skyscrapers and celebrated progress could also build a murder castle and look the other way while it operated. And that fascination has never left us. You can feel it now, even as you watch this, your heart beat a little faster. Your mind trying to picture those hallways, those rooms. You are participating in the same ritual the Chicago citizens did over a century ago, staring into the darkness because you cannot resist knowing what stares back. The murder castle was not just a building. It was a machine designed for one purpose, to turn human life into profit. Every wall, every hallway, every chute and secret door existed to serve that goal. And that is why it haunts us, because it forces us to confront a question we rarely ask. How many other machines like this exist, hidden in plain sight, operating under the guise of normal life? Holmes' castle was simply a visible, physical example of what happens when power is unchecked, when secrecy is allowed to flourish, when a single man's ambition goes unchallenged until it is too late. And when we look closer, we see that the world is full of castle systems, institutions, entire industries designed not to protect life, but to consume it. Holmes built his castle on the promise of comfort and hospitality, but inside it became a slaughterhouse. How many modern castles promise safety, prosperity, and opportunity, but behind their walls quietly drain people of their freedom, their resources, even their sanity. That is the most disturbing truth about Holmes. Storiette is not a relic of the past. It is a warning about the present. Holmes did not invent the idea of exploiting human life. He simply made it visible. He built the horror into bricks and mortar, a place you could walk through, a place where you could hear the locks close behind you. But today's castles are invisible. They are legal, financial, political design, so that you never see the moment the door closes. And perhaps that is why we return to Holmes again and again, why his name refuses to fade. He left us something tangible, a symbol, a way to understand what power looks like when it devours without conscience. And when you realize this, the story of Holmes becomes something else entirely. It stops being just a crime story. It becomes a map, a blueprint for understanding the darker architecture of the world you live in. The castle may have been reduced to ash, but its shadow still stretches across our time. And if you are willing to keep descending with me, we can follow that shadow even further to the places no one wants to see, where the real castles still stand. What made the castle so terrifying was not just the murders, it was the intention. Holmes built it with purpose, brick by brick, imagining every possible scenario, every movement of his victims, every way to keep them disoriented, compliant, and silent. This was not chaos. It was order, and order designed to break human will. The castle was a place where the rules were rewritten, where Holmes became judge, jailer, and executioner, and where his victims had no escape. And yet, as disturbing as that sounds, we cannot look away, because on some level, the castle represents something we all recognize: the architecture of fear. We live with it every day. Every society has its invisible walls, its locked doors, its systems that keep people where they are. The castle was simply an extreme version of what already exists in human psychology and in human institutions. That is why it fascinates us. It is not just the horror of death, it is the horror of losing control. The victims of Holmes did not die in a chaotic explosion of violence. They died slowly, methodically, knowing there was no way out. And that slow death, that creeping sense of being trapped, speaks to something primal in every viewer who hears this story. It is the fear of being at the mercy of a system you cannot fight. That is why you are still here, still watching, still following this descent. Part of you wants to see where this leads, because part of you knows you live in a world full of castles, corporate castles, political castles, psychological castles, and you want to know if there is a way to escape them. Holmes' castle was a mirror, but it was also a warning. The warning is simple. When power goes unchecked, when charm and intelligence are used to manipulate rather than create, the world itself becomes a trap. And once you see that, you can never unsee it. You begin to notice how many locks are around you, how many doors are controlled by someone else, how many rooms you have been led into without realizing you were already inside a maze. That is the legacy of the murder castle, not just terror, but awakening. After Holmes' execution, America should have turned away in horror, buried the memory, and moved on. But it didn't. Instead, it kept digging. Holmes' story appeared in newspapers for years after his death, in sensational pamphlets, pulp novels, and later true crime anthologies. His face became instantly recognizable, his name synonymous with genius-level evil. And here is where something unsettling happened. Holmes became a kind of celebrity. People collected photographs of him, toured the ruins of the castle before it burned, and wrote to newspapers speculating on how many he had really killed. His story was retold not to warn but to thrill. This was the birth of what we now call true crime, but back then it was more raw, more dangerous, less polished for entertainment. Holmes had turned death into a business, and now the country was turning his life into one. Even today, more than a century later, his name sells books, documentaries, films, and tours. People stand on the corner of 63rd and Wallace, where the castle once stood, just to feel the air, to imagine the screams. What does this say about us? That we are not only horrified by evil, we are addicted to it. We want to understand it, yes, but more than that, we want to taste it, to stand close enough to feel the chill without being consumed. Holmes knew this about people. He understood human curiosity, and he used it against his victims. He offered them safety, security, cheap rent. He gave them what they wanted most, and then he took everything. That is why his story never dies, because it reveals a hunger we don't like to admit exists. When we read about Holmes, we are not just reading about him, we are reading about ourselves, about the part of the human soul that is drawn toward the abyss. And if you are still here, still watching, still following this trail deeper into the dark, it is because you know this is not just about a man in 1893. It is about the structure of the world you live in now. The castle is gone, but the fascination remains, because on some level, we all want to know how close we can get to the edge before we fall in. Holmes was not an isolated figure. He was a prototype, and once he showed the world what was possible, others followed. His methods, the compartmentalization, the planning, the cold manipulation of trust, became the blueprint for the modern predator. Decades later, names like Albert Fish, Ed Gein, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy would haunt headlines, each of them echoing some part of Holmes' design. Gacy, like Holmes, hid his horrors behind a mask of normalcy, luring victims into a world from which they would not return. Bundy charmed his victims into vulnerability, using intelligence as a weapon. Gein, like Holmes, created a physical space that became the theater of his madness. And what chills us most is not just the similarity between these men, but the realization that the world has created fertile ground for them to exist. The systems of control, the structures of power, the anonymity of City Soul of it allows predators to operate, to vanish, to thrive. Holmes taught us that a killer does not have to lurk in the shadows. He can stand in the middle of the crowd, smile, and offer you a handshake. He can run a business, build a hotel, and profit from the very people he plans to destroy. And when we zoom out, we see that this lesson does not just apply to killers. It applies to corporations, governments, entire institutions that have been caught exploiting the very people they were supposed to serve. Holmes may have built his castle out of wood and brick, but modern castles are built out of laws, loopholes, and contracts. They do not need gas pipes and trapdoors. They have fine print and locked-in agreements that keep you exactly where they want you. That is the forbidden truth. Holmes was simply ahead of his time. He saw the world for what it was, a place where those who are clever enough and ruthless enough can create their own rules and live above everyone else. And if that does not make you uneasy, it should. Because if Holmes could do this in 1893 with a few bricks and a crooked architect, what do you think the powerful can build now with technology, surveillance, and data? The castle may have burned, but its spirit has multiplied. Holmes' castle should have been the final warning, a scar burned into the collective memory of a nation. It should have forced America to confront the danger of leaving ambition unchecked, of trusting the wrong man simply because he wears the right suit and speaks the right words. But history shows us something chilling. We didn't learn the lesson. After Holmes, the world didn't become safer. It became more efficient. The very systems that allowed him to thrive grew stronger. Urbanization accelerated, anonymity deepened, and the machinery of progress moved faster than ever. The castle was demolished, but its design lived unduplicated in ways Holmes could never have imagined. The factory assembly line, the corporate skyscraper, the government institution, each one became a structure designed to process human lives, to turn them into output, to keep them contained. And like Holmes' victims, most people don't even realize they are inside until it's too late. This is why the Holmes story feels so modern, so current, so urgent. Because we are still living inside castles, only now the walls are invisible. Our movements are tracked, our data harvested, our choices narrowed without us ever noticing the moment the doors locked. Holmes used hallways, gas pipes, and hidden chutes to control his victims. Today, control is digital, psychological, algorithmic, and yet the feeling is the same, the sense that something larger than you is moving the pieces, that you are inside a structure you didn't build, playing a game whose rules you don't understand. This is why Holmes terrifies us, because he is not just a figure from the past, he is a reminder of the present. He is the whisper that tells you to look closer at the systems that surround you, to ask yourself who built them and why. And if you are honest, you will feel it's the uneasy truth that you may already be standing in a castle of your own. One designed not with bricks, but with decisions made long before you arrived. The real question is, will you notice before the door shuts? This is the point where most people turn away. Up until now, it has been safe to treat this as a story, a piece of history, a curiosity from the past. But the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to keep that distance. Because now you must face the truth that the castle was not an isolated nightmare, it was a reflection of something far bigger. Holmes was not a lone aberration. He was the embodiment of a principle, the principle that a clever mind can shape the world to trap others and profit from them. That principle is alive and well, and if you keep watching, you are choosing to look it in the eye. This is where it becomes personal. Think of the systems around you, your workplace, your city, your government, your daily routines. How many of those structures are designed for your freedom, and how many are designed for your containment? How many take more than they give, drain more than they offer, and yet convince you to thank them for the privilege? Holmes was honest in one way. He built a place where the walls were visible, where the trap was tangible. You could touch it, you could feel it. Today's traps are invisible, psychological. They are designed to make you comfortable while you are being consumed. And that is far more dangerous. Because when you cannot see the castle, you do not try to escape it. If you feel a chill right now, good. It means you are awake enough to notice that something is wrong. The story of Holmes is not just meant to shock you, it is meant to prepare you. You are staring into a mirror, seeing the hidden gears of power and control that most people will never look at. And I am asking you, do you want to keep going? Do you want to know what lies in the deepest rooms? The rooms even Holmes would not have entered. Because there is still more to uncover, more to reveal, and once you see it, you will never be the same. If you are still with me, type "I see the castle" twice in the comments below, so I know you are willing to keep walking through this darkness with me until the very end. If you are still here, then you have chosen to face what most people refuse to see. And now we come to the most disturbing truth of all. The castle never really ended. It changed form. It spread. The castle was not just a structure of wood and brick, was an idea, and ideas do not burn. They replicate. They find new architects, new builders, new opportunities. After Holmes, the world saw an explosion of organized cruelty, wars that turned killing into industry, governments that built camps and prisons designed to process death with terrifying efficiency, corporations that profited from human suffering while hiding behind contracts and logos. Holmes was a single man. The castle was his personal empire. But when he died, the blueprint remained, waiting for anyone ruthless enough to pick it up. And they did. The 20th century became a parade of castles each, larger, more efficient, more impersonal than the last. That is why his story refuses to die, because on some level we sense that it is still unfolding. Somewhere, right now, there are men like Holmes. They may not build trapdoors and gas rooms, but they build systems that consume lives all the same. They wear suits, they smile for cameras, they shake hands at charity galas. They have learned that you do not need a physical labyrinth to trap people. You can trap them with debt, with addiction, with promises of success that never materialize. And here is the question that gnaws at us. Do we really want to find the next castle, or do we secretly need it to exist? Because the castle gives shape to our fear. It gives us a villain to point at, so we can avoid asking harder questions about the world itself. Holmes may be dead, but the castle lives on every time a system values profit over human life. Every time a person is reduced to a number, every time someone disappears into a machine that was built to consume them. That is the last and darkest truth. The castle is not just out there somewhere. It is here, all around us. And sometimes, if we are not careful, it is inside us, too. So here we are, standing in the ashes of the castle, staring at what remains. And now you know the truth. It was never just a hotel, never just a crime scene. It was a blueprint for how darkness operates in the world quietly, cleverly, efficiently. Holmes has been dead for over a century, but his lesson is still here, waiting for those who are willing to see it. The castle teaches us that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It invites you in, offers you comfort, promises you safety, and only when the door locks do you realize what you have entered. And if you have stayed with me through every room, every hallway, every revelation, then you have seen what most people refuse to see. You understand that the castle was not just Holmes' creation. It was humanity's creation. It was built out of ambition, greed, and silence. It was built because people looked the other way, because they believed progress could not hide monsters, because they wanted to believe the smiling man was harmless. And if there is one thing this story demands of you, it is that you stop looking away. You stop assuming the castle is gone. Because if history teaches us anything, it is that castles are always being built. New walls, new traps, new ways to turn human beings into fuel for someone else's ambition. The question is not whether they exist. The question is whether you will recognize them before you walk through the front door. So take this knowledge seriously. Do not leave it here. Share it. Talk about it. Shine a light where others refuse to look. If this journey made you feel something, fear, anger, clarity, turn that feeling into action. Like this video so it reaches more people who need to hear it. Share it with someone who still believes the world is safe. And subscribe so you never miss the next descent. Because this is not the end. The castle may have burned, but the path we are walking is far from over. You and I are not done exploring the places the world tries to hide. The next story is waiting, and it will be darker, sharper, and even closer to home. If you are ready for it, let me know in the comments. I will not look away. Say it twice. Say it like a promise. Because from this point on, you are no longer just a viewer. You are a witness.